Hello, my name is Dr. William Haden Chomphosy. I'm an assistant professor of economics and business at Hendrix College and a non-resident fellow of the Pulaski Institute. My work focuses on environmental economics, and in today's kind of video, I will be discussing the concept of revenue neutral carbon pricing. So over the course of the next few minutes, what we'll be talking about is exactly what is carbon pricing and then what makes it revenue neutral. We'll then move on to a discussion of how this particular tool would affect rural communities within the United States, and then follow it up with a discussion of real-world policy proposals for revenue-neutral carbon pricing, and provide some links and some resources to learn a little bit more about how these policies are developing within the United States. So, a carbon pricing tool is some kind of policy that puts a price tag on the emissions of carbon dioxide that come from general economic production. So the reason that we might want to put a price onto carbon dioxide emissions is because carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. As greenhouse gases accumulate in the atmosphere, over long periods of time, they contribute to a process of climate change that can have negative effects on the environment and our modern economies that both produce the emissions but also depend on the environment for inputs to production. So whenever we put a price on carbon dioxide emissions, what we're trying to do is internalize the cost of those emissions that we will ultimately see in our environment and in our economy. Now, so that's one half of the definition, right? So we have a carbon pricing scheme putting a price on carbon dioxide that should be approximately equivalent to the costs associated with those emissions for our environment and our economy. Now, the other part of this definition, this concept of revenue neutral carbon pricing, is that as this price tag on carbon dioxide, as it gets paid, the money does not necessarily just stay there, right? We're generating these revenues as we are putting a price on carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases, and we want to ask, what do we do with those revenues? So whenever we have a revenue neutral policy, we would take all of the revenues that are generated by the carbon pricing scheme and actually put it back into the economy, and specifically back into the pockets of the citizens within that country. So here's how it would kind of work. As there is a price on carbon dioxide that gets paid, right, as more emissions are created, those revenues are collected, but then instead of being put toward anything else, each household within the United States would actually just receive a lump sum of cash, whether it's each month or each year. There are a few different ways that the policy could be actualized, but essentially it puts the money back into the pockets of the people, right? So that's important because, for one thing, as there's a price on carbon dioxide, that could influence the price of goods. This process of giving the money back to people gives them the ability to account for those higher prices. So the revenue neutrality of a carbon pricing tool is very important, right? It has two effects. First, the carbon pricing should create an incentive to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions and slow or at least mitigate the consequences of global climate change. In addition, the revenue neutrality gives money back to people so that they can pay potentially higher prices in the interim period as companies are having to pay for the carbon dioxide before they, kind of reduce their emissions. But it also stimulates economic growth by giving people a greater capacity for spending. So that is what is that's what we're talking about whenever we're discussing revenue neutral carbon pricing. The second point that I want to discuss in this video is how this type of policy or this tool would affect rural communities. So the first thing I want to talk about with respect to the rural communities is the fact that, as we have seen over the past several decades, thinking back into the early 2000s, 90s, 80s, the greatest consequences of climate change that we've been seeing in the United States are through extreme weather events. I'm talking about wildfires extreme flooding, and drought. So these types of events have a greater consequence on rural communities, particularly these communities where there is a lot of agricultural production. If we think about the problems of wildfires, extreme flooding, and drought, we can acknowledge that it's more rural communities that have our woodlands, our waterways, rivers, lakes, swamps, things of that nature, and most or all of our agriculture. So those three extreme weather events of wildfire, extreme flooding, and drought those are tied to the process of climate change, and they have a greater impact on rural communities. If we can take action against global climate change, or at least mitigate some of those consequences, then we would expect to see, in the long run, a reduction or at least less severe wildfires, extreme flooding, and drought. So by taking action on global climate change, we're actually going to benefit rural communities because they are, by and large, going to be suffering some of the greatest consequences of the problem. In addition, we have to think about the revenue neutral side of revenue neutral carbon pricing. As money is going back out to households, we have to keep in mind that rural communities will benefit more from this kind of lump sum cash transfer. Rural communities generally have the ability to stretch their dollar more, right? So prices can be lower in rural communities, and this kind of cash transfer will help them a lot more because the dollar can stretch farther. It is also worth acknowledging, however, that in rural communities there are other expenses that could be influenced by a carbon pricing scheme. In rural communities, we tend to see more travel distance. So if you live, let's say, 30 miles away from the nearest town that has a grocery store, a hospital, post office, something like that, then you might be expected to be driving more. And so that carbon price would affect the price of fuel, so gasoline, whatever it may be. So that effect would be seen as well. So there are more complex forms of revenue neutral carbon pricing where the cash transfer that goes to households can be kind of attached to the burden of the pricing scheme, right? But for the purposes of this video, we'll keep it kind of surface level and essentially say that there are a lot of benefits in the rural community to a revenue neutral carbon pricing scheme, in the sense that we're going to be reducing the effects of global climate change that are concentrated in rural areas. B, by giving cash transfers to people who can actually get more out of those cash transfers due to cost of living. But that has to be balanced against higher prices associated with energy and fuel, which can be a larger portion of people's budgets, of households' budgets in rural communities. So this is kind of the idea that we're trying to develop here. So revenue neutral carbon pricing can be a real boon. It can be a really good thing for rural communities, but we have to be mindful of the costs as well. So if this is a topic that you want to find out more about, I encourage you to look into additional resources. This concept, this tool of revenue neutral carbon pricing has become very common, and there's a lot of activity and discussion around it among both economic and business worlds and environmental advocacy groups, right? So there are two big policy proposals out there for the United States that advocate for revenue neutral carbon pricing. The first one has been really promoted by the Climate Leadership Council, and there will be a link in the page below to go and visit the Climate Leadership Council's page and see their policy and their recommendations for a revenue neutral carbon pricing tool. The Citizens Climate Lobby is another group that is promoting an additional revenue neutral carbon pricing tool. There will also be a link to their group. So both of these policies are characterized by putting a price on carbon dioxide emissions, having it revenue neutral, which means that the money goes back to households. They differ in a few ways that could appeal to, different people, but I encourage you to look into those websites and explore those resources.